Welcome to the Objective Recovery podcast, where we talk about mental health very open-mindedly. Today's guest is Butler. He's an expert on company science, people science, and making the process efficient. Brett, tell us a bit about what you are doing and what kind of challenges you see that are related to mental health.
Absolutely. Well, Henrietta, thanks so much for having me on. I would explain my kind of entrepreneurial journey as a lot of twists and turns. I always had the entrepreneurial bug at heart. I was the kid that had the lemonade stand. It evolved into selling homework passes. I got into real estate a little bit, financial services, where I was starting to build a team. And I thought when I was in college, I wanted to study corporate finance and corporate law to understand how law and business kind of came together. Quickly realized that that wasn't what I wanted to do. Following my college education, I got into cryptocurrency. I had no idea what I was doing, but I invested. And luckily for me, it exploded in value. And from that, I dove in headfirst. I was a part of a couple different projects, community management, being able to do financial due diligence, things like that. And kind of the defining moment for me was I was a part of a project very early on. There was about 20 members total. And in a matter of months, myself and a couple of other key people took it to over 50,000 members and over $100 million market cap. The problem is that immediately following that, the founder ran away with all the money. And so it was a massive jolt to all of us, to say the least. After that, I tried to figure out how I could combine crypto with traditional finance. So I worked at Bank of America and Merrill, and I really got to interact with a lot of different people at different life stages. As we all know it, then COVID happened. And so as you can imagine, thinking about mental health, stress, and how it applies to the workforce, that really was the moment where I took a step back and I evaluated all of my experience as an entrepreneur, building teams, hiring people, training people, and really started to understand and kind of talk to other hiring managers and recruiters to really do a deep dive. And the more I dove in, like you said, it's a massive issue that people really haven't figured out how to optimize, whether you're dealing with mental health issues, people that don't necessarily know what they want to do as a career, global. I mean, there's so many different opportunities and challenges. And so that's what we do at HireSphere. We have a global council that helps create ideal avatars for a role. So we identify what makes a top performer, the technical, the business, the soft skills, and then we work with companies to be able to define their values. So if you go to a website and you see entrepreneurial drive, that could mean completely different things for completely different people. So we get a actual definition and we use that to be able to screen applicants before they even interview. So when we get our applicant pool that we want to interview, then we actually handle the interviews for the company. So we can go through technical and behavioral interviews and pick up a lot more information because our council has done tens of thousands of interviews. And as you can imagine, it's beneficial to the candidates because they have a more streamlined and efficient process. And they also get data because, as you can imagine, when you're trying to apply to jobs and you don't get them, a lot of stress goes up. So we can give them actionable feedback based on what we're getting. And to the companies, we can be able to help them shrink their hiring process and be able to put good people with good companies so that way both can be able to succeed. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but that's what I do, my journey, and kind of how all of it ties into mental health and the hiring. And then also we can talk about once they're hired, what does that look like for leadership and other opportunities as well.
Thank you for this detailed explanation. I hired many people and for different teams. There were quite a few cases when people appeared during the interview process and even in the beginning of their work with us, very physically very good. There was no really red flags. But later on, they started coming and caused a lot of issues. And so I must admit that I had to, unfortunately, let people go due to that. And I was always very careful with that. So I would give people usually many chances and a lot of discussions, but sometimes it didn't help. So I'm just very curious, how can you predict the probability or the potential of these issues surfacing later on?
Yeah, well, it's important to know that it is a science that is continuously evolving. And so for us, what we start with is trying to eliminate a lot of the big rocks. We look at talent as not as they're good or bad people, but what is the fit for this role at this company at this stage? As you can imagine, startups have an entirely different culture than Fortune 100 organizations. And so ultimately, we want to understand, what are the goals of that individual? They could be personal, professional, and what are their triggers, good and bad? Because if we know that and we understand the culture and environment that they're joining, even if it's a top performer that matches all the criteria on a resume, when you understand the person, you realize that they're not going to be happy. The company's not going to be happy. And so that's kind of where we start. We go through a lot of behavioral questions. And so you've probably seen on my LinkedIn, one of my favorite ones is just to ask what's their 2, 5, and 10-year goals. That tells me a lot about a person, what potential challenges they've been through, what they aspire to be. And from that, we can then dive deeper into other more applicable conversations around the role.
That's very interesting about the goals, because that's also something that I tried definitely with pretty much everyone that I hired. And my experience was that people usually prepare for the interview and they basically create like even a script, make a script, and so almost make up those goals. And so make up or not, it depends on the person. But very often those goals change, and sometimes very rapidly. And if the person was not honest in the first place, that's very common, because interview technique. This is something, it's a skill that people usually learn. Then the real self comes out later on, and it becomes very obvious. So how can you deal with this? So how can you figure this out, these types of discrepancies? How do you use technology for these types of predictions?
I think that it's really a combination of scenario-based questions, because you're right. A lot of the open-ended ones, like tell me about yourself, what are your strengths and weaknesses, people prepare for. But if you go with scenario-based questions to where if someone has truly done something or they've truly experienced something, they're going to be able to talk about it in much greater detail. You also combine that with what you're seeing. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen interviews where people are clearly looking like I am right now at another screen. And it's like, okay, I've got my script there, or I've got an AI that is giving me a regurgitated answer. And so for us, it's just as much the science of how they're saying it, what their body language is, what their micro expressions are, and really combining all of that, because this is how they're going to interact with their team members, with other clients or customers. And so it all kind of comes together. It's not just one component, no different than when you're working with mental health patients. You're going to try and be able to use different techniques because people are going to respond to different things. Maybe somebody's more of a visual learner, others are more data driven, others prefer small group settings, others prefer large group settings. Another one is good or bad. It's just context, because again, our goal is to set up companies and individuals for success. So the more that we can dive into these and have open conversations like you are, the more we can make sure that we're doing that. Because we do both of them a disservice if we get somebody a job and they quit within 60 days. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help the business.
Sometimes people, in my experience, plan that, though. Some people are really smart. So, that I work with addiction. That's my primary interest. And I also experience addiction. So many people who have that problem, for example, among many other mental health issues, but addiction especially, people become very secretive. And unfortunately, part of the condition is that many people become exceptional liars. And that means that, they are able to basically manipulate the environment and the interview and the coworkers and so on. So I'm very interested in what you mentioned about body language, because this is again from how I studied addiction and other mental health related conditions. What we know about how the brain works is that many of the driving forces behind these issues, mental health issues, are unconscious. So they arise in the first place in an unconscious manner due to traumas and sometimes other predispositions. And it's a self-defense mechanism that people just are not even aware of their own behavior, and they learn even unconsciously to react and to act on autopilot. And some people who have very long-term experience, let's say an addiction, again, very secretive issue usually, they learn to keep it really behind the scenes, and it can be very hard to discern it from a superficial connection, like an interview, even in the beginning of a work relationship. So how do you use body language? Because body language, I like that, because that's usually something that we don't consciously control. So that's a very good sign, a very good marker of unconscious processes.
Yeah, part of it is just being aware and being able to call it out. So a lot of the interviews that we do, if they're not in person, they're all recorded. And we actually have technology that is going through the process of analyzing not just what someone says, but what's the total context to it. So like whenever you were talking and I was smiling and leaning in, you naturally know, okay, they're listening more than likely. What's interesting is what you brought up, where a lot of times people will have some of these different responses that they don't even know is happening. And it may be trauma driven, it may be that they do have an addiction, or maybe it's just something that is subconscious that they don't even aware of. One big thing we see is where people are constantly talking with their hands, type of thing.
I do that a lot myself.
Exactly. And so it's really interesting to be able to, just ask about it. And I've had multiple interviews where, whether it's a mock interview setting where I'm talking with different teams or a candidate, and it's kind of one of those reset buttons to where it's a non-intimidating question because I'm not grilling them on something. I'm curious. You're talking a lot with your hands. I really enjoy that. Is that something that you normally do? And it'll kind of reset them. Say, wow, I didn't even know that I did that. Or where did you notice that? Now, well, I noticed when you gave this response about your experience at company XYZ, you were constantly using your hands, and then you didn't do that when you talked about this one over here. Did you enjoy that role more, or was there something that kind of triggered it, or is it just were you not even aware of? And little shout out like that gets them noticing that, okay, this person's actually listening. They care about the responses that I'm giving, and I'm doing it in a non-threatening manner. And this is even after somebody's hired, and I'm sure we'll probably get to this, but talent acquisition and people management is just when you hire someone, that's the beginning. I mean, because it's not like, oh, congratulations, you're on payroll. I'm never going to see you again. I'm going to see you every day. And so, like you want to cultivate those relationships and be aware of different body language that people are giving, because then you can see, okay, what is normal? What isn't? Are they leaning in? Are they looking away? Are they constantly acting a certain way about a certain topic or a certain client or a certain individual? And like you kind of use all those as context to build up the relationship and really understand them as people, not as numbers or a means to an end, but hey, you're a great person. I brought you here for a reason. I want you to be a part of what we're doing so you can achieve your goals. And by framing it like that, you have a much more open dialogue, even in the interview, all the way up to when somebody's onboarded.
I like the idea of probing into it with the person, but do you actually do that during an interview, or this is just later when they are already hired? So do you ask them, for example, let's say, would you ask me why I'm using my hands a lot when I speak when you interview me, or it's just later?
It would depend on the position. A lot of times I find that like if you are uh, a customer service representative or you're like very forward facing, that animation and that energy is very important. And so absolutely I'll ask about it because I'm like, wow, you're obviously very passionate about, what you're talking about. That's great. And so it's never a negative. And even if you're kind of a back end role to where maybe you're more data admin, I'm not going to look at it as a negative. I see it as, okay, they're clearly excited. They want to be able to share and they're open. No different than somebody with like their arms crossed. Body language could be interpreted one way versus another. It's not good or bad. It's just information that you use.
I like the idea of observing how they react because I completely agree that can be very revealing. That can be an indication of lying, for example, not being honest. Observing, I guess, someone who is not comfortable with themselves and they are making up something, then probably they become defensive. Is this what you see in a process?
It oftentimes I'll get kind of one of three categories. The first and most common is they're aware of it and they're not necessarily trying to do it, it just happens. That's probably about 70% of the time.
Yeah.
20% is they're unaware of it and they have no idea it even happened whatsoever. And then the 10% is like you say, where they're obviously hiding it. It's kind of one of those reactions to where, as you know, their brain is trying to do so many different things at once because they're looking at another screen, they're trying to read an answer or provide something that's regurgitated rather than a memory. And so their body's just naturally doing a bunch of different things. And how they respond is going to give me an indicator of how that happened. No different than tone of voice, eye movement, all sorts of indicators that I'm sure you get when you talk with potential clients and people that deal with addiction and even normal human beings as well.
It's one thing that I see quite a lot is these days many people call neurodiversity or neurodivergent conditions. And so people, for example, people who have autism and others, they have a certain, so the idea is that even their brain works, it's wired differently and works differently, and the communication style can be very different. For example, many of those people can have problems with making eye contact and things like that. So I guess the challenge here is to be able to tell apart that condition and someone who is not honest. Because I deal with this a lot, because many people who have addictions and other problems, actual problems, they have some of that background. So I see it all the time. And so how to discriminate between that and someone who is just hiding something.
We're learning every day, just as I'm sure you are. And you're right. You have to take everything with a grain of salt because there is so much variability in humans, trauma. Are they just stressed because it's an interview? Or are they hiding something? And so that's where really building the foundation for that relationship so you can uncover it and being open, transparent yourself. I think that's how you start that conversation. You don't look at it as, regardless of what the other person is doing, is a bad thing or there's anything wrong with them. You're just trying to understand it so that way you can be able to set them and the company up for success.
Do you usually give them feedback, straight feedback that this is, let's say, that these are the reasons for the rejection or that they are not of interest anymore, or you just basically end the process there and they never learn?
I definitely always try and be able to provide feedback, whether I'm doing the interview or even clients that I've consulted with prior to HireSphere. I think giving people actionable information is appreciated as long as you're doing it in a respectful and professional manner. Understand that you're not going to get every single decision right. None of us are, whether it's hiring, finance, business, food, whatever. And so if you can be able to go into that interview understanding what you're looking for, and then number two, be able to understand, how are you actually measuring that when someone meets, exceeds, or does not meet expectations? So there's some sort of defensibility there. You can then go to a candidate and kind of have a conversation with them around, here's what I saw. Were they having a bad day that day? I've had all sorts of trauma that's happened in my life. Families sick. You could just be having a bad day. Woke up on the wrong side of the bed, whatever. So I try and take that into account with it, but I also try and be able to tell them that this is what the business is looking for. Here's what your application said, and here's what myself or the team saw in the interview. And based on that, here's what you can do in the future to improve. And more importantly, what I find is really beneficial is because you start to get more of a picture of this person, are there any other roles or even career paths that they could be able to pursue that they may not even be aware of that they're a great fit for? So, like the example that you gave, someone that maybe has something like autism, for example, and they have a difficult time doing making eye contact or things like that. In an interview, if you don't have that context, it could look like they don't care about the role or they're unprofessional. but they could be a rock solid person on the back end doing everything from accounting, operations, whatsoever. And so I always like to leave any interview where the client or the company feels like they've got actionable information as well as every candidate.
So that's fantastic because it sounds like it's almost the interview, even if they don't get the job. The interview serves almost like a therapy session, so they get feedback and they can incorporate that win-win in any way. So let's say that you have not been able to, even with the advanced technology, spot some issues, hidden issues, and the person gets hired and starts working. And then happens what I described in the beginning, that issues start to come up. So, for example, they are not as productive as they could be. They don't meet deadlines. They don't meet expectations. So, how do you suggest dealing with a person like that as a new hire?
That's a great question. And we see it a lot with various businesses when we come in, because a lot of times that's what's caused them to want to work with somebody outside of things. And for me, I like to use the mentality of you really want to set that new hire up for success. And so the way that you can do that is, in my mind, shorten the feedback loop time. So you don't give them a task that takes 90 days because it's going to take 90 days for you to figure out whether they, are they on track or not. Do something early on that's 2 or 3 days, and then don't come at them if they don't fulfill that role. Come down with the iron fist. You want to be able to understand and develop rather than punish, if you will. You want to
Yeah.
support them. And so if you go through that first exercise, let's say it takes 3 days, and they come back to you and they're about 80% correct, you can have a conversation no different than you give feedback to anybody. You can talk about, here's opportunities to improve, but also here's what you did well. And let's circle back in a couple of days and make sure that, you've hit the deadline. And once they've done that, then it extends to a week, a month, etc. If for some reason after multiple times they're not performing well, or like you say, maybe they were a good performer, but that performance is trending down, then you can proactively get ahead of it because you can be able to say, okay, is it me? Did I communicate something incorrectly? Is the scope too much for their capabilities? Do I need to bring in other people? Or is it, temporary thing that's going on in their life, or is it a permanent? But you can approach it with that lens of not coming down on your employees and giving them every chance possible to be able to succeed and really empower them. And I say that because when you ultimately get to a decision to be able to part ways, most of the time that way, it's done in a professional manner. And it allows you to not burn a bridge. And it also allows that employee multiple times to be able to improve. And the only other thing that I would say is like a weekly check-in. I do that with all of my existing employees as well as any client, 5 to 15 minutes. It allows you to work on brevity. It allows you to talk about, hey, what are you struggling with? What's draining your energy? That's a good way to be able to understand and proactively catch burnout. Or is something going on? It may be that if you have that relationship, they'll share, I have a family member who's really sick. I'm sorry, I'm not on top of things right now, but okay, now I have that in my mind. I don't have to wait a week, a month to be able to see that we didn't hit our deadlines. Let me reallocate some help over there. What did they do good? Because you don't want it to just be, oh man, I hate looking forward to this meeting because the boss is going to come down on me. And then how can I support you? And if they have that framework, then they have everything they need to succeed. And you, as a manager, are building a culture that people want to be a part of. And that reflects itself in the hiring process. You have better applicants and you have people stay longer because they want to be a part of that culture.
So the building the culture right from the beginning, especially when we are building a new startup, that's very important. I completely agree. Actually, your first point of creating a short-term project in the beginning, one way I deal with it, actually in most cases, at least for my startups, is I never hire someone for a full-time position in the first place. So usually I take them as freelancers in the beginning, and then we just work on a specific, quite short project, and it's not full-time job for them. And then we see, let's say, a month or, even sometimes just a week or a couple of weeks, and then we conclude and we discuss and decide if we want to work together for longer term or not. So that has resolved a lot of problems. Unfortunately, that's not always possible to do. For example, when I worked for a larger organization, I didn't have the freedom to tell people that you must be a freelancer first. So that did not resolve the problem. So I want to go back a bit to the actual mental health related issues that can surface. Can you just share a few examples? What are the most common issues that you see?
Yeah, I would say right now, one of the most common ones that I see are like mental health issues related specifically to finances. I think that there's a lot of people that are struggling, whatever, wherever they are in the world. And so naturally they're wanting to be able to get a job because they've either lost their job or, they're struggling with debt, loans, whatsoever. That's normally one of the first ones that I see. And typically I can filter that out through the goals question because they'll spend a lot of time talking about finances. Maybe they want to pay off credit cards or they want to be able to own their home or they've got kids that they want to be able to put to college and they'll spend 80% of the time on that. And then they won't mention anything with health or relationships or spirituality or anything, any other area. So that's normally a good trigger to where you can see, okay, they're clearly financially motivated. Why? And then you can kind of see in the body language, a lot of times people will give like something like that to where they'll look away. And oftentimes that can be like stress or shame or something like that. Uh, I see it a lot also in candidates that are just getting out of school because they're dealing with somewhat identity issues because they for their entire life it's been okay, go to high school, graduate high school, go to college, and this is their first time going into the workforce. So if it's entry level roles, a lot of times you'll see things there to where they really don't know what they want, but they know they need to get a job to pay student loans and try and figure it out. I see things there. I'd say those are the two most common. And then that we can filter out early on, partially just because you could see on an applicant, like, hey, no experience or anything like that. I think that's helpful for a recruiter or an interviewer to go in with that mindset. So that way you don't look down on if you're hiring for an entry level role, if someone is giving stress indicators, well, they could still be a great fit in the organization to fit everything because you have that context going in.
Definitely, but I really like what you said before that what observing what people speak a lot about. I think in my experience, sometimes it can be the opposite as well. Let's say when someone is really hiding, let's say that someone has a financial problems that we just discussed. Another version can be that someone who is completely unwilling to get into to discuss any financial topics or personal finance. This is actually, in my experience, maybe again because I deal a lot with already known mental health issues that many people display it in this way rather than talking a lot about that problem topic. So I think it's good to have an eye on both. So what we say, what we engage in excessively, and what is actually lacking, because that's almost like what we discussed in the beginning, an indicator of the unconscious, because people are sometimes when they are hiding, again, they are not doing it consciously, and every second, every minute. So that can also be a good technique. Let's say that the person who has these types of issues is not an inexperienced, an early career person, but one of the more advanced executives, for example, at a company, and someone else spots these behavioral issues. So how can we deal with that? What do you suggest, or how have you encountered this, and how have you dealt with it?
I did. One of the first major companies that I consulted with, and I wasn't even doing anything with hiring. It was more kind of documentation and fundraising. But part of that was like extensive due diligence on all of the C-suite, essentially, because you wanted to make sure that their LinkedIns were good and just investors were going to dive into everybody's backgrounds. And somehow, some way, I found out that one of the executives had a gambling problem. And unfortunately, it did not go well to where he was in a very, very bad financial position. And that was actually motivating him to encourage the company to fundraise because then he would be able to get a larger salary and pay off a portion of his debt. And so in that instance, when you're in a leadership position, it's much trickier than if you're not a manager because that behavior, culture, mentality can really have a trickle effect across the entire organization. I mean, it affects morale, it affects strategic decision. I mean, that's a major thing for the company. So the way that we really dealt with it was first meeting with them one-on-one. And I wasn't a part of the initial conversations. I was kind of drawn in later because it wasn't really my department at the time. But confirming that, hey, this is out there. It's going to become public. What do you have to say? And let's get you help. I give the example of you're in a boat that's taking on water and you're getting another person that is trying to be able to get a cup to pour water out, but I want to plug the hole to stop us from sinking. And in that instance, the individual met one on one with kind of the head of HR. And then from there, all the C suite and kind of the consultants that were working on this fundraising engagement came together. We actually got him the help that he needed, and we kept it really tightly contained internally, partially for the out of respect and privacy for him, but also for the company. And it was the best thing possible because, unbeknownst to them, his kind of junior person was already doing 90% of the work that he was doing, anyways. And so from that, it created a really good opportunity to promote this other individual. And it showcased to the entire team that we're going to take care of our own and prioritize their mental health and their wellness over necessarily, hey, this is what's great for the company because he had 30 years experience, et cetera. And he ended up coming back in kind of an advisory role a couple of months later, but company was able to fundraise. We gave an opportunity to someone else and this other individual was there. And I think the big takeaway was taking decisive and swift action rather than just kind of letting it marinate, but also starting private and then not involving people that didn't need to know before they needed to know, type of thing.
This is another problem that I dealt with personally, more in the larger organizations. And so usually it's so that they already have an existing culture, and sometimes it's such that people don't feel comfortable speaking up. So I hear that one thing that you are suggesting over and over is to be very open, like we are openly discussing these topics today. That we always speak openly and check in, have a regular check-in time. So I give you an example from my experience. So again about addiction and drugs. So and in healthcare on top. So one characteristic of healthcare, the healthcare industry is unfortunately mental health issues are often penalized, which means that healthcare professionals sometimes, if they have their own problems, even if they get into treatments and they address their problems, gets on their medical records and it becomes known at the organization and out in the open, they can lose their license to practice as a doctor or nurse and so on. And so you can imagine what the consequences of these rules and this law can be, that people are just hiding. And also very often people don't feel comfortable speaking up. So I guess one solution is that if there is at least one person, and usually in the best case, it's the top, the CEO of the company, especially if it's a small company, who actually always interacts, communicates in that open way. So everyone feels a bit more compelled to address. What do you do if these problems, what do you suggest if these problems still keep occurring? So people don't respond well even to this very empathetic, tolerant way of interacting and dealing with it. How long do you think these behaviors that get in the way of productivity be tolerated? What metrics to use when what is the threshold and how to measure that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, like so many things financially, it depends on the organization, the stage, the role. The general answer, though, like if I'm going into a business and I'm trying to create standard operating procedures, I like to operate on like a 90-day threshold, meaning that within that 90 days, we've essentially gone from identifying the issue, we've had multiple check-ins, it started with the support, and then it's escalated, whether it's every week to 2 weeks. Maybe it then goes to a month. Then there's another month, and it's very evident that their productivity is dipping. In terms of percentages, each one has different KPIs. On average, I I typically see anywhere from a 20 to a 30% dip in productivity overall, but oftentimes it can also be sharper. So like if it's a really traumatic issue, a lot of times I see this in for both positive and negative. So positive, hey, I've got a wedding coming up, and I'm really stressed about planning the wedding, whether it's the bride or the groom, things like that, or if it's a funeral as well. And a lot of those, I think that's again where having the understanding of is this a temporary thing, or is it a bigger issue like a gambling or another addiction type of thing? Because if it's an addiction, it's going to be ongoing. And so you try, at least my practice is to keep it with as little people as possible in the beginning. So that way you're respecting their privacy and you're not calling it out to everyone and making a public example out of it, because I don't think that ends up really doing well. But over 90 days, you would have met with them between 4 and 6 times in escalating fashion. And in each of those meetings, you're not only understanding where they're at, but you're creating expectations for the next meeting to where here's what we're expecting you to do when we meet in 15 days. If you haven't met this, this is the next step we're going to take. And it's very clearly communicated. So there's no, well, I didn't know type of thing. The hope is that you don't even have to get anywhere near that first 90 days. You can solve it within 30 days or even less. And it doesn't have to escalate. And that's just for your internal operations and capacity, but also being able to have the support that that individual needs to get the help that they need early on. So that way it doesn't become a bigger issue.
One reason is it's not only that we are sometimes too forgiving, but it's also if there is no, let's say that the role that employee with the problem fulfills, it's very important. They are still performing to a basic level, and it's very important to get it done, and there is no one else who could replace immediately. I think this is very often the reason why those people are kept, because they have a unique skill set and they have issues as well. And the best practice is to not to deal with it in that way, but to probably immediately look for others, right? Is that what you would suggest, to look for candidates when someone, let's say that not the performance issues persist and the 90 days is nearly over. So would you start to interview other candidates to fulfill that role?
Yeah, in an ideal situation, if I could control everything, I would onboard someone exactly like you said, to where they're on a project basis in the beginning. You could see how they work, they're paid, so that way everybody's happy. Then they get onboarded because you have more information and interaction with them. At a certain point in time, they have this issue. Roughly 60 days, I'm starting the process to go and feel out internally as well as kind of within my network of people to replace that person. And I will be very, I will be forefront with the individual in that last meeting about that. That if we meet, let's just say on day 60, it's you have 30 days to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And we've gotten to this point, and I want to let you know that if this is not met, you will be terminated or whatever like the situation would demand, but you will be let go. And this is essentially notice. And here's why. And everything has been very transparent, but that way the organization as a whole doesn't suffer. So on day 90, if that person's let go, I'm not starting from scratch, but I'm also not giving false hope to candidates in interviewing for a role that isn't open, because we see that all over the place as well. And usually I find that most people, when they're in that instance, about 75% will come back within the first 30 to 60 days. And then the remaining 25%, once you get to day 60, it's closer to 80% won't make it. Because if they haven't making that change within the first 60, Rarely will they do it in that last 30 days, but I always give them that opportunity just because it's really easy to understand and it contains it to a quarter. That being said, if it's something egregious or fraud or gross negligence or any specific company value that is a zero tolerance policy, that is entirely up to them to get rid of them earlier.
So the keyword is being transparent, I guess, right? So always being transparent. Again, if it becomes part of the culture, people, we mirror each other, just like we do sometimes in these conversations. We pick up each other's gestures and the behavioral styles, and so that's the same for a longer term, more complex culture, company culture. So I would like to, in the last question, I would like to look back a bit to the beginning, to the profiling that you do when you screen candidates. So I guess you can call it a type of psychological profiling, right? Is it ethical to do this? Because I know that I talk to many people about this, and some people immediately become very defensive. Maybe that's a good sign, as discussed in the beginning. But still, many people just don't like the idea of being analyzed in the background by an AI and things like that. So how do you do that in the beginning when you're in the hiring process? Are you transparent about that as well? Do you tell them explicitly what data is being collected and that we are observing your body language, your behavioral cues, and so on?
This is one of my favorite questions that I love to be able to talk about because anytime you talk about profiling and the ethics of it, you get into things like consent and privacy and fairness with hiring, especially in hiring because people want equal opportunity. They don't want to be judged by anything other than like their merit. And that's really what we strive to be able to do. Typically, I would let a client know, let a potential candidate know early on in the process that they'll obviously read it before they log on that, hey, if this will be recorded, we're going to be scanning X, Y, and Z. Most people, though, they don't really read it. They just scroll down to accept like we normally do.
Yeah.
But I typically, if I'm doing an interview myself, I'll let a candidate know when I'm kind of doing the debrief, here's what the process of the interview is going to be like. Just so you know, we're just having a conversation. My whole goal is to make sure if you're a good fit or not. Here's kind of what I'm going to be monitoring. And if you have any questions for me at the end, feel free to ask. Here's kind of next steps. So we cover all that again in the beginning. What I really like about the way that we are using it is I don't like to think about putting candidates into a box as much as being able to get an accurate representation of who they are and setting them up for success. So ultimately, I want to take what we do and be able to build this giant database of verified candidates and companies. So in the future, when somebody else is hiring, I can say, hey, this person's background has been validated. Here's actual information and data, and they can get an opportunity that they may not have even been aware of, that they may not have even essentially applied for. And also let them know kind of like what I talked about in the beginning. A lot of times, we may be unaware of some strengths and weaknesses that we have. And so whether a candidate gets a role or not, they have access to see their profile. Like as we start building that out further, it's not something that is private, but I don't want it to be manipulated by someone, including us. I want it to be digitally verifiable and fully accessible by anybody within our database. And so for that, it's really creating opportunity rather than saying, we're only accepting people that, speak this language, have these skills, things like that. It's more so, I'd love to be able to have a database. So when people search for candidates or they have a role, I can say, well, I have 100 candidates that are great people that I think could be able to fit. Let's go through and define your values as a company and take these 100 and say, okay, of these 100, these 10 actually fit those values in addition to the skills.
So they do get access to their data. They can see that profile.
They will be, yes. We're very early stages of those profiles, but yes,
Okay.
they will be.
It's another value that I'm not aware of any company that sometimes I'm sure you know about what companies do. They use these established personality typing systems. There are several. I have done many of those tests myself, and it can be interesting and insightful. But I think you are doing something deeper, analyzing these more unconscious signs, because usually what is shared in those tests is more that people are aware of. Is there anything else that you would like to share about what you are doing, what's in the works before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say if anybody is interested, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm sure we can tag it on uh, this episode. Right now, we are just focusing on the interview as a service. And if you are a recruiter or an interviewer and you want to be a part of that, or if you're a client that's looking to be able to interview someone, we'd love to be able to work with you. And as we roll out more information, we'll have it on our website, HireSphere AI. And I'm sure, Henrietta, we will continue to do a bunch of stuff and support each other as well, so they can get a hold of me on LinkedIn or our website.
Okay. And so your contact is your LinkedIn, or is there other way to get in touch with you?
They can reach out to me via email as well. They can reach me at what would be brett.butler@hiresphere.ai. But LinkedIn's typically the easiest, just so that way I produce content pretty much daily, and all of our website links are on there as well.
So we will link and we will include all this contact information in this description for the viewers. So Brett, thank you so much for sharing all this with us, and I'm very excited to see how this unfolds, because I'm super interested in anything that can make work more efficient, and especially if it's based on these psychological cues and understanding of people. So thank you again. I wish you all the best.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.